Hi, everyone. So we're recording this call tonight between some staff members of the Informed SLP and some of our colleagues and friends. And basically everyone who's joining this call tonight is someone with either a PhD or an SLPD or is working toward one of the two. And the reason we all got together tonight is so we could discuss the differences between advanced degrees in speech language pathology. So you should be watching this video if you're in the field of speech language pathology. And keep in mind that we're not talking about master's degree programs. We're assuming that people who are listening to this call are either completing a master's degree currently or will be soon or completed a master's degree many years ago and are instead looking at options for degree advancement after the master's degree. Another thing that I should clarify with this video content is that the way we discuss these two advanced degrees in speech language pathology, the SLPD and the PhD, likely only apply to people in the US because our academic system and our degrees and what sorts of jobs you can get after these degrees is going to vary a little bit. So like if you're in Canada or Australia or the UK, you might get something out of this video, but just keep in mind that all of us are in the US, and so we're going to be presenting with a really US-centric view. So I'll go through and we can all introduce ourselves so you know who we have on the call tonight. My name's Meredith Harold, and I am the owner of the Informed SLP. And I'll kind of go through and call on other Informed SLP staff members first so that you all can introduce yourself and let us know where you're coming from. So Molly Schenker.
Sorry, had to unmute. I'm Molly Schenker, and I work for the Informed SLP in I guess a variety of positions, just kind of whatever Meredith has to get done. She emails and says, hey, can you write? Hey, can you do Pinterest? Can you do audio? And just kind of pull that together as it comes. I am working on my PhD at Kent State University, and I should finish my comps in the spring and be toward dissertation phase after that. And in terms of, I still do a little bit of clinical work. So I work for a couple of different private schools just here and there to help pay the bills. So that's me.
Thanks, Molly. And Danielle.
So my name is Danielle Garland. I work for the Informed SLP doing writing and social media, and I work at Niswonger Children's Hospital. So I do primarily pediatric acute care. I have a master's currently, so I think I'm here as like the token person who's shopping for some type of doctoral program.
Allie.
Hi, I'm Allie Sauerwein. I also write for the Informed SLP, and I have my PhD. So I'm in my second year as an assistant professor at Southern Illinois University at Edwardsville.
Kelly.
I'm Kelly. I'm an adult medical writer for the Informed SLP, and I am a doctoral candidate at the University of Kansas Medical Center. So I'm hopefully in my last year of my PhD.
Javier.
My name is Javier Hasso, and I'm a PhD student, third-year PhD student at UT Austin. Confusingly, I'm living in Philadelphia, and I also write for the Informed SLP, and I have some experience in school-based and early intervention.
Kelsey.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kelsey Mandak. I am a research scout for the Informed SLP and a writer. I received my PhD from Penn State University last August. And since then, I have been working for Penn State as the AAC Research and Outreach Coordinator.
And Don.
Hi, I'm Don Finan. I've got a PhD in speech physiology and neuroscience, and I'm working for the Informed SLP as a topic area expert. I'm a professor at the University of Northern Colorado in Greeley, Colorado, and my areas of expertise are kind of motor speech, voice, speech science, acoustics, those areas.
And Lindsay.
I'm Lindsay Zorowski. I have a SLPD degree, and I work at the school district of Palm Beach County in Florida, and also as an adjunct professor at Nova Southeastern University.
And April. You have to unmute yourself.
Apologies. Hi, everyone. I'm April Jardis, and I live in Kansas City, Missouri. I'm in my 4th semester of my SLPD program at the University of Kansas Medical Center. For my job, I do a lot of different things, but my main job is I'm the clinical education coordinator for Rockhurst University in Kansas City. And I also do quite a bit of clinic work in the community, mostly post-acute medical rehab.
Perfect. All right, so as you can see, the people we collected here tonight are a good combination of people who have had their PhD for a few or many years, people who are currently in a PhD program, people who have had their SLPD for a while, people who are currently in an SLPD program, and people who are kind of considering the pros and cons of these various degrees. So the first thing I wanted to start with is just kind of a description of the bare bones basic difference between an SLPD and a PhD. And I think the easiest way to describe it is that a PhD is a research degree. And so you get a PhD because you're interested in science and interested in doing research. Whereas an SLPD is more about taking on advanced clinical roles. And so you are going to learn about research with an SLPD, but there's also a lot of other things you can be or do with an SLPD. Now, both degrees, a PhD and an SLPD, you'll see people who teach with these degrees. So if you're interested in teaching, you kind of have to weigh the difference between whether or not you're wanting to do teaching plus a heavy amount of research, or teaching exclusively, or something else along with teaching. That's one of the most common things I see people get confused about, is kind of what you can do with each of these degrees. So let's talk about each of them one at a time in terms of what you learn during the degree and kind of what types of jobs you could take afterward. So let's do the PhD first. I think it's a little bit more straightforward because the PhD has been around for a long time. So there's lots of people in our field who have PhDs, not enough though, so it's not saturated. If you want a PhD, go get one. But it's kind of clear what sorts of jobs you can take because it's been around for a long time. Whereas the SLPD is a much newer degree, which is where I think kind of the confusion enters. But those of you who are in a PhD program or have recently gotten a PhD or had a PhD for many years, or even have PhD students, other than research and science, what other things do you feel like you have learned or do learn in a PhD program? It's mostly about the science, right? And you guys can just like systematically unmute yourself. Just chime in, because if you don't talk over me, I will just talk the whole time.
Yeah, I just want to, one thing that I'll add to that is many PhD programs do have some instruction and teaching. Mm-hmm. So you do work towards the kind of eventual work placement of the university and teaching at that level. I'm not going to say that's universal across all PhD programs, but many of them really do have quite a bit of instruction on how to teach, different methods of teaching, and then also you get experience teaching during that process too.
Raise your hand if you are in a PhD or got a PhD and did teaching during it. Yeah, so pretty much all of us, yeah. Because I mean, most scientists work at universities, right? And so most people, if they're doing science, will be employed by a university, and if you're at a university, you're expected to do some amount of teaching. Other stuff that you think is important for people to know about what they're doing during a PhD?
I do think it's interesting to think about the SLPD, like you mentioned, Meredith, as sort of that you can take a deep dive into a content area, because in my PhD, I also did the same, right? So my area of expertise is AAC. So I continue to take advanced coursework and create independent studies and do research, and all of that centered around AAC. So I still got to focus in that major area. Where our program was different is that we got to pick up a correlative area as well, and we had some flexibility there. So for me, my interest was teaching and learning, and I actually do research on teaching and learning in our field. So I got to sort of piecemeal the best of both worlds. Like I got that advanced content knowledge and really got to dive deeper into AAC than I could in my master's, but then also got to pick something else to really complement that interest as well. But also, like you said, we had coursework and research and ethics and statistics and all of that. That were good as well.
And so PhD programs take on average of about 4+ years. Like if you get it done in 4 years, you're doing fairly well. Wouldn't you guys with PhDs say the current average in our field is around 4 to 6 years-ish? Yeah, yeah. And then what about the SLPD programs?
So for me, since I finished, mine took me 3.5, 4 years. I graduated about 5 years ago. So I finished, now it's fuzzy, but I think 3.5, 4 years. But it was 53 credits of academic coursework. So it's a lot of coursework, but I think maybe the difference when we're talking about the differences, when we look at master's versus SLPD, the differences, I think is really taking a much more complex view of coursework. So pharmacology, business management, counseling, a lot of the coursework that we we took advanced, dysphagia courses. Now I'm a school-based SLP. Dysphagia, yeah, but I took dysphagia and I'm like, that wasn't, it's not my area, but we did it. And, we had choices for some things, but we did an advanced AAC course. A lot of coursework that you don't do in your master's that you do in your doctoral program. And I think like for some of these courses, the impact that it had on my clinical practice is what I think is most significant. So like the pharmacology class really had a significant impact on my clinical practice, especially working in the schools when I think about my caseload and how I really take that approach with my students I work with and the counseling piece of it, because that's really not a piece that we get in a master's program. And when we look at the day and age we live in, counseling is a huge piece that we are lacking in our clinical practice from master's programs. And then we have a dissertation as well.
Yeah. And most SLPDs are currently, now this isn't, consistent across them, but most PhDs, not all, but most are full-time. Most SLPDs, not all, but most are part-time. So it's kind of like a different, so when Lindsay, when you say it took 3.5 years, that's not full-time 3.5 years. That's another like difference too.
Well,
and go ahead.
I guess, so when you say part-time, you're saying because it's like we're working while doing it, right?
Uh-huh.
So I guess it's perspective, because I was taking a full course load, but still working. Mm-hmm. So I was able to work, but still taking a full course load while doing my SLPD program, but I wasn't going part-time.
Gotcha.
So I guess it's perspective on that, because there are others who do take less of a course load, or, as they start are not able to do as much and then take longer. Especially as they get into that dissertation piece. But for most of us, as we go through our cohort, we're taking the max number of credits that we are supposed to be taking and are doing it full time while working. Some people do go, back off their jobs a little bit while they're going through their SLPD program.
And as far as the content within the SLPD, it's really individualized from student to student, right? Which a PhD is too. But what types of stuff, April, are you seeing in your SLPD program that students are, doing and learning while they're in the program that might be a little bit different than a PhD?
Well, first, I'd just like to comment that my program is looking a lot, just being halfway through is a lot different than what Lindsay's describing her program to be. Mine's only roughly 30 hours. I'm able to pick my courses, and I'm really having experiences across several different departments at KU and KU Med. I'm driving to the University of Kansas some days to take higher education administration courses. And then I'm spending days in the rehabilitation sciences program doing courses in interprofessional education and neurorehabilitation. And these are all courses that were picked by me. I am set to finish in 2 years. A colleague of mine is set to finish in 2 years and will be finishing next semester. And then I have another colleague who finished in 1.5 years, and she took a full-time load. So I think that it probably just goes to show that each program is different significantly.
Yeah. And how much you back off your full-time job while you're doing it, whether or not you adjust that would probably make a pretty big difference.
I think that's significant, especially since I work in higher education. I have a little more flexibility than I would have if I was working in full-time clinical practice.
Mm-hmm. And what sorts of, because we already mentioned how, people will get their PhD because they're interested in doing research. That's kind of like the primary reason to do it. What sort of career opportunities or reasons are you seeing for your colleagues getting SLPDs?
I see a couple, I was contemplating this question earlier, and the people that I see who are motivated to get SLPDs in my circle are those who are working in school districts who are interested in maybe going up and over on the pay scale. That's a reason that they're entering into the SLP degree, or they want to work in higher education, particularly in some type of a clinical instructor or supervisor role. And then I'm also seeing a lot of SLPs in my area, at least, that are wanting to do private practice and really indicate a specialty in something. And so the SLPD is a really good way to indicate additional expertise and experience. And so that's been kind of the motivators in what I'm seeing.
Yeah. And as far as just to like clarify like the teaching thing, so the people who are in higher ed or are interested in entering higher ed and get an SLPD so they can take on more advanced roles within higher education, I do think that it's important that we talk about job opportunities related to that, because I've seen things all over the place. So it's usually easier for PhDs to get a tenure track position, right? So when a faculty job opens up at a university and it's a, communication sciences and disorders or speech language pathology department in the US, it's easier for PhDs to usually get whichever job they want. It can be harder for SLPs to get those jobs, depending on how big the university is. So like small universities, sometimes they need a certain number of PhDs in order to maintain accreditation. And so they end up having to hire PhDs over SLPDs, even if they wouldn't necessarily care either way, just because of accreditation. Whereas larger institutions I've seen have more of a combination of faculty that are both PhDs on the tenure track and SLPDs who are taking like teaching and clinical roles. Is that pretty consistent with what you all are seeing? Because I hate to because SLPD, if with an SLPD you can definitely teach and it's definitely possible, but I hate to lead people on to think that they can have any job they want with an SLPD, because I've seen people hit some barriers with that and have to kind of shop around institutions before they can get the job.
Right, and I would agree. I think that it depends on the university. Some universities don't recognize an SLPD because it's not a terminal doctoral degree, and so it will really depend on the university whether or not they will hire you to teach at that level. So for myself, I'm an adjunct professor at Nova, but that's where I obtained my doctoral degree. So they recognize that as a higher education degree, and so I teach at that university. There are other universities that will hire SLPDs, but it's not all universities. So it really does depend, and I think that having that candid conversation is important, because we don't want to mislead everybody to think, yes, with an SLPD degree, you can just go teach at every university, because not all universities are going to recognize that degree as a terminal degree, and it is not seen equivalent across the board to a PhD.
Right.
I would just add, and it depends on what university you work at, because a lot of universities that have larger professional training programs, graduate programs that have PT, OT, nursing, they do recognize in other disciplines, they recognize that clinical doctorate as a tenure track degree. And so a lot of the discrepancy actually falls to our profession, because OTs and PTs have that clinical doctorate, and that's considered terminal. And they're able to stay on the tenure track and rise through the career ladder with that.
It'll be interesting to see how that changes over time, don't you think? To see it, because the SLPD is such a new degree. There aren't that many people that have it. And it hasn't been around for all that long. I did a search earlier on ASHA EdFind to see how many SLPD programs I could find, and I found 7, which I'm not sure if that's accurate or not, but I know there's not that many more than that if it's inaccurate.
I think that sounds about right.
We might want to bring up what a tenure track position actually is too.
Oh, yeah. Will you describe that for us?
Yeah, a tenure track position is typically an academic position for a researcher slash teacher. And again, traditionally, it really is at the PhD level. And the responsibilities for that job are to teach, to do some type of professional activities, which are typically research and grant writing, that type of thing, and publications and presentations, plus also service. So universities basically have that as kind of a designation for the job requirements for tenure track position. And what the tenure track means is you can apply for and get tenure, which is tenure is basically a way of ensuring academic freedom, in that the university pretty much can't tell a professor what they have to teach and what they have to research. It gives the researcher the ability to research topics that they're interested in and teach topics the way they want to, the way they think is best to be taught. So that's what tenure is. And most positions, the tenure track position is actually very, very different than a non-tenure track position as far as the university goes in terms of funding. So a tenure track position is one that kind of continues year after year without having to renew a contract. In other positions, the person might have to sign a contract every year, basically, and they're kind of hired on maybe for that short term of a year, and then that contract would be renewed. So it's quite a different position overall. Some universities do allow tenure track positions for people with clinical doctorates. Actually, my university does. We have 2 people on faculty who have clinical doctorates, and they're in tenure track positions, and they have the same job responsibilities as other tenure track professors. But you're right. Lots of universities don't recognize a clinical doctorate as a terminal degree, like a PhD as a terminal degree, and therefore they wouldn't allow that person to even apply for a tenure track position.
I like that your university does that. It just opens up flexibility.
Yeah, it's definitely different than most. But I will say this, to work in a tenure track position with a clinical doctorate, you have to have the ability and the ambition to do those activities, meaning teach professional activities like research and publications, grant writing, as well as during service. And all those requirements are still the same depending across what degree you have. So if you have the background, some clinical doctorates, the people who come out with the clinical doctorate actually do have quite a good background in research or writing and grant writing and publication. And some clinical doctorate programs don't have that as part of their curriculum. So they might not really be able to perform those required duties that a tenure track position would have.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about what you learned during the degree, what types of job opportunities could follow it. We've talked a little bit about time to degree and time commitment. Let's talk, do you think there's anything we haven't covered in those topics? I've got my little checklist of things I want to make sure that we cover for everybody. And Danielle, freeze us if you think that we haven't deeply covered some of these enough.
Can we quickly touch on the idea of PhDs who don't go straight into academia? I know that we have talked about this occasionally, and I think that when I'm on social media trying to pick a path for my own life, this is the struggle that I hear other people having, which is maybe I want academia eventually. So maybe I want a PhD to ensure that I can teach eventually, but I don't want to do that right now. So can I get a PhD and do something else with it in the meantime? And I think a lot of people struggle with that of, I don't want an SLPD because I'm afraid it will hamstring my choices or limit my choices later. But I want the doctorate, so maybe I should just go for the PhD and then figure it out from there.
Yeah, so the concept of setting yourself up so that you can have whatever job you want. Yeah. I mean, if you're trying to set yourself up to have whatever job you want, to a certain extent, if nothing else was a factor, the PhD probably is the best choice, to make sure that you're not going to be limited in any of these different, places you could be hired, to be perfectly honest. And the other thing that I think is worth talking about is the fact that there's a lot of kind of traditions and expectations within academia, particularly for PhDs who are doing research and teaching and going for those tenure track positions. There's a lot of tradition and expectations around what path you follow. So for example, after I got my PhD, a lot of people advised me that if I didn't do a postdoc, I wouldn't be able to get hired in heavy hitter research jobs ever again, because I didn't follow the path that I was supposed to, right? And that path is that you get your master's degree and then you get your PhD, or maybe you did the two of them together. And then if your goal is to do really strong research, then you go to postdoc after that, which is kind of an aside that we haven't mentioned yet, but a postdoc is basically additional training post PhD, generally away from the institution that you were trained at, so that you can start to learn more about science outside of just, you know, the advisors you had and the lab that you were in. And then people apply for tenure track jobs after that. And those of you who are in academia, probably Dawn especially, because you've been around long enough to know and kind of see how it goes, and even like Kelsey and Allie watching what happens with your peers, there is a little bit of bias and gatekeeping, to be perfectly honest, in higher ed, where if you don't have the vita or resume they expect you to have, you can kind of it can be harder to get jobs. So it became irrelevant to me because the university I ended up going to was a teaching institution more so than a research institution. So they didn't care at all. Like the fact that I did other things after my PhD, like working as a school-based SLP and opening business and stuff, was a complete non-issue for them. I had no problem getting a job. But if I had tried to apply to one of the top research institutions, I wouldn't have gotten the job. So does anybody else want to comment on that? Like the concept of like setting yourself up to make sure that you never do something that would limit what you might want to later do 5 years from now or 10 years down the road.
I'll jump in a bit, because I heard a couple different things to consider. And one is that people might want to consider teaching at a university later, and what degree would help them get to that ability to teach at a university. Both the clinical doctorate and the PhD would allow that, actually. Clinical doctorate might not allow you to go for a tenure track position, especially at the high level of research institution. That's probably not going to happen because they expect a lot more research training and maybe even a postdoc, as you mentioned. But teaching is different. And universities hire a lot of adjunct teachers and they hire a lot of instructors. An instructor position is not a tenure track position. It can be a position that is maintained for a long time, but the instructor position is one in which the person is teaching and maybe doing clinical supervision as well, but they're not bound by the requirements of a tenure track position. So they don't have to publish, probably. They don't have to do research. They don't have to look for grants. That aspect of it, they wouldn't be required to do, but they could still teach. So clinical doctorate could still open those doors, in fact, they pretty easily open those doors for an instructor position or an adjunct position if someone wanted to, let's say, keep working clinically, but also teach at the university level. That's very doable, and a lot of people do that with clinical doctorate. A PhD, in terms of that path of going for the PhD and then going for the postdoc and to try to get at the high-level research university, that's to a certain extent true, I think, the way you described it, meaning that if you don't have quite the qualifications, the high-level research institution might not be looking at your application as one that they think is going to work. But I think a lot of that comes down to the university knows that in order to get tenure at the university, the person is going to have to jump through a lot of hoops. And those hoops are things literally like obtaining grants and publishing research papers, and sometimes publishing in top-tier research journals. And that's actually not necessarily just the department has those requirements, but the university itself. So one thing the university does when they're hiring faculty is basically, and this is coming from my perspective at the university, we're looking for people we think will be successful in the position. And if they demonstrate to us based on application that we think they can do the job, meaning all those aspects of the job in order to get tenure, that's what we're looking for. And if it doesn't look like they'd be able to obtain tenure based on their training or their history, work history, they haven't worked towards doing many research projects or something like that, perhaps, it would be much more difficult for them to obtain tenure at a university. And if you don't obtain tenure at a university, you're in tenure-track position, then you have to leave. That position is literally a temporary position until you get tenure. So it's pretty tenuous, actually, to take that position, and you have to prove that you can do the job in that tenure-track position with those requirements. Otherwise, the job is over and you have to move on. And that's something that happens at especially high-level research universities. But across any university, the tenure requirements basically say that. You've got to meet these standards to get tenure, and then you actually get that academic freedom that tenure gives you. But if you can't meet those standards or don't meet those standards, then that's it. There's no second chance. Mm-hmm. So universities do look for, when they're hiring for a tenure-track position, they have to look for people they think are going to be successful in those positions. But universities also hire for instructor positions, like I said, all the time, adjunct positions all the time, and those are different. They don't have the same requirements. Mm-hmm. So those positions, a PhD could work in those positions, a clinical doctorate, someone with a clinical doctorate could work in those positions too. And both are really common.
I think the one thing that often confuses people is the idea of dabbling in research. I meet a lot of people who are interested in research and they want research to be part of their career, but they can't figure out how. And I think that's because there aren't very many easy, clean avenues for like dabbling in research, right? Where you do just a little bit of research, but you also teach and you also, have a caseload of clients. It's just not particularly easy. Like the more common path is for somebody to kind of, choose to do research and really zero in on it and get lots of training in it. And the concept that you mentioned about, universities, if they're hiring a researcher, are looking for people who have experience and will be successful in getting grants and publishing papers and all that stuff. I see a lot of people that want to be somewhat involved in research. And unfortunately, I don't think there's a lot of models for how to do that. There's a lot of people out there who do kind of like dabble in research where it's part of their career, even though it's not their main responsibility. But those people aren't always, visible to others in our field. I feel like there's not a lot of good examples of what that can look like because it looks so different for everybody.
I'll just say one thing real quick, and then I want to see what you guys have to say about this too. But I think the positions I just highlighted, instructor position and even adjunct, that's actually the people who like to dabble in research, do some research here and there. Those positions work for that.
Yeah.
Because what can often happen is that the instructor or adjunct faculty member can basically team up with a tenure-track faculty member to work on a project. And that's just not uncommon at all, especially if someone is an instructor at a university and has been for a number of years. You can develop those relationships and then work on some projects with those other people. Collaborative projects are really, really a good thing.
Yes. I mean, that's like ideal.
And I think you bring up a good point, even, as someone who has a clinical doctorate, I know for me, I like the idea of research. I don't necessarily want to be the one to now, after having done my dissertation, I don't want to be the one to do all of the scientific write-up and all of that. That's not my passion. I like the clinical piece of it. So I know, and I've brought this up to Meredith, but I have talked about partnering with a university researcher to do the clinical piece of it, like in the trenches piece, because I work in a school, and then partnering with a researcher at a university. So we have the best of both worlds to be able to do that, which allows me to do the part I love to do and let the researcher who's on a tenure track do the part that they like to do and need to do for their position as well, which again gives us both the pieces that we want to do and like to do. And I think that that's something that we don't see a lot of in our field. And I think that ASHA is also trying to promote more of, which is that clinical research or partnership too. But we just, it's not that easy. But I think we are all trying to see and do more of as well.
Yeah, totally. We all want to see more of it happen. It's just trying to figure out how to set up those partnerships in the confines of like who pays us and how we get paid. You know what I mean?
And the approval of it in the real world and within our jobs and those studies.
Yeah. Okay, let's talk about some of the other stuff. And if I move us too fast and there's something we didn't mention, just butt in, stop me, or write it down or whatever. But cost, let's talk about cost, financial issues, all that type of stuff. So for PhD, the ideal situation is that you get your tuition paid for, or at least partially paid for, by the university. And then a lot of times students are shocked to learn that this is a thing. They think that they're going to have to pay, with student loans for every last dime of the tuition and everything. But for those of you who recently went through PhD programs and you did it yourself and saw colleagues and stuff, will you comment on kind of how that works, the concept of like being on a grant that pays for your tuition and doing TA-ships that pay for your tuition and all that type of stuff?
So I'm currently getting my PhD. And so the way that it works is I work as a GTA, or people are on a GRA, so a graduate research assistant or a graduate teaching assistant. So my responsibilities are I teach classes, and essentially that funds my PhD, it funds my tuition. So I have to work what they consider 50%, which is 20 hours a week essentially, and that funds my tuition and fees, or most of my fees. And then I get a little stipend, so I get a paycheck as well. But then I also have to pay for the rest of life. So I also work outside of my PhD as well. So it does fund for most of your tuition usually. I actually applied for my PhD a little bit different, because I applied for my PhD on like an off cycle. So when I was first applying, they'd already done all their funding for that year when I was applying. So my first year I didn't have funding. And that was kind of my fault, because I didn't apply during like a cycle and I still got into the program, and they had told me like, you're probably not going to have funding your first year because we've already done the funding for your PhD for this year of the PhDs. But after that I did. So I work outside of school, which is not highly recommended when you're in a PhD program. But that's how it usually gets funded, is that you work as a TA or a research assistant, and that's how you have your tuition paid for most of the time.
So I don't know if this was good advice, but when I was applying, someone told me no doc student should ever pay for their PhD program. And I said, okay, well, I'll just go with that then. So I actually was part of a fellowship program at Penn State through the Department of Education. So my tuition was paid, I received a stipend. However, I do have a service obligation. So every year that I was on the grant, I have to work 2 years in a university position, doing research in AAC, teaching AAC, and so on. So a lot of my peers were on, like Kelly said, they were graduate teaching assistants or research assistants, and they had to work 20 hours a week. However, they didn't have a service obligation. So when they received their PhD, they didn't necessarily have to go into academia, as I do have to do, unless I want to pay back that tuition and stipend.
And I think it's important to talk a little bit frankly, if you guys are comfortable with it, about what the stipends usually are. Because some people have kids or spouses, and have to really know exactly what their financial situation would be. From what I see in the US, it seems to me that most people's stipends are around $20,000 to $30,000 a year. Is that about what you guys are seeing with your peers? Keeping in mind, this is an estimate. nobody quote me on it. Nobody be like, Meredith said the average was 20 to 30K. I'm just saying this based on people I talk to. Do you guys feel like that's high, low?
I feel like that was high for around here. In Ohio, I don't know what other people in my position would be making in their full-time grad assistantships, which would be 20 hours a week. In my case at my university, my husband works here, so I don't pay tuition. So that's a huge perk for me, and it was a huge factor in choosing this university to come back to get my PhD. And so for me, having worked full-time before I went on for my doctoral program, it was hard for me to give up the safety net of the pay I was making as a clinician and go down to that graduate student pay just because I have a child at home and a family to feed, So I was able to make more money just taking my tuition from my husband's benefit and then teaching a class here and there, and then working on the side as a clinician. And I continue to do that just because it makes more financial sense for my family.
I was going to add to that, Meredith. I think the numbers I've seen have been closer to 20, low 20s at the highest. That may be just sort of the cohort that I'm familiar with, or the Midwest. And I also was the same way, same as Molly. My husband was also in professional school at the same time. I'm not sure why we chose to do that, actually, looking back. So we were both in school. So I had a GTA or GRA assigned through the department. All 4 years I was in my PhD, but then I also sought out an additional opportunity at the Center for Teaching Excellence, which added a small stipend. I did that work weekly, and I worked 5 to 6 hours a week in private practice. So it was sort of this like piecemealing of opportunities together, knowing that somewhere around the 20s, low 20s was like the starting place for a stipend.
Yeah. So a lot of people still take out student loans, even though tuition is paid for, and even though they're getting a stipend, a lot of people still will take out student loans to end up being able to like pay for rent and a laptop and clothing and all that stuff. What about SLPD, Lindsay and April? Have you guys seen opportunities for support?
I did not, and I was working full time. So, I mean, I had my job, but then for my tuition, for the entire time, I know April said her program's a lot shorter than my program was, but for my entire program, I was looking at about $85,000 for my entire program. And then I did, because I work full time in a school, as soon as I graduated, I did get the $17,500 special educator loan forgiveness, which it was just the timing, because I had been, I did the 5-year special educator one, which it was just the timing of when I graduated with my doctoral degree. So I applied it right to the balance of the loan. So that got forgiven right off the top of the loan. So I dropped it down to like 70. And now I'm in the 10-year public loan forgiveness program because I'm in public education. So I'm hoping that after 10 years, my loans will get completely forgiven, which is the perk of working in a public school. So not a high amount of pay, but I did see an increase in my pay from getting a doctoral degree. So not a lot, but a little bit. And but no, I did not have an opportunity for any assistance there, but I couldn't have taken on anything because that would have meant taking away from my full-time job. So that's, and I wouldn't have been willing to give up my full-time job for anything.
Yeah. Is that about what you're seeing too, April, where most people in SLPDs are taking out student loans to pay for it?
Yes, that is. In my situation, I'm part-time enough that we're able to manage it monthly out of pocket, just because of the cost of the tuition. And so that's been nice. I work a full-time job, and I also PRN to help with that a little bit. So it is challenging, but also I think the financial aspect of it was one of the main reasons that I chose the SLPD over an EDD or a PhD. Just because it was more affordable for me and my family at where we are in our stage of life right now.
Yeah. So I feel like a direct comparison in a lot of ways would be hard. Like if you're like, which costs more to get, the SLPD or the PhD? Because it's not just about tuition and whether or not you can get reimbursement for tuition. It's also about how long are you leaving your full-time job? How much are you get paid at your full-time job? And so there's like all these factors that kind of play into it.
I also think, how much do you take out in your loans? Because are you taking out some extra to cover books and some extra living expenses and things like that to ensure that anything else that you need, like when you get to that dissertation part, are you taking out some part of your loans to cover an editor and things like that? Some of those things that you don't consider when you're entering that process.
You hired an editor? That's awesome.
I know.
I love it.
I mean, I passed my IRB process the first time. So.
Yeah, yeah.
I think it's worth pointing out that part-time PhD programs seem to be very few and far between, but if you find them, there's generally no funding at all. So that's like they're not similar. They're more similar to SLPD in that sense than they would be to an actual, like a full-time PhD program.
Yeah.
Could I jump in, just going back to the PhD side of it? So one of the comments that really resonated with me was that, you know, working as a full-time clinician for a few years and then having to transition back into the grad school kind of mentality. So I think for people out there who are thinking about transitioning to a PhD student, to be a PhD student, like one of my strategies, and I think a lot of my colleagues kind of have taken a similar strategy, is to save a lot of that money, kind of to prepare for those years. It kind of, you know, like first year and I think second year PhD students who have their C's are still pretty happy, and then by the third and fourth year, it's a little bit more of that piecemeal idea that that somebody just mentioned. But I think another thing that I wish I had known a little bit more, and I'm still trying to understand, is the different sources of funding, like external, internal, in your department, you know, associated with your lab specifically, and then when you're at the dissertation phase, the different mechanisms for funding like a certain project. And yeah, I feel like just doing research into what those mechanisms are can be very, you know, can be very helpful in terms of getting more funding.
Mm-hmm. And usually people at the university will kind of guide you, and you might have to also do some extra research, you know, with people outside of your university as well to learn about as many opportunities as possible. Yeah. I also think, so while we're on the topic of financial, let me ask you all this. So I personally think it's in some ways easiest to do these degrees, the PhD in particular, the younger you are, because you have fewer financial obligations. And I think that that's something that's not often discussed. Is a lot of times what I see in my peers is they have this idea that, okay, I'm gonna go work as an SLP for a while before I get my PhD because I want the clinical experience that can help inform my work, which is definitely smart. But the con of that is the longer you're out, usually the more financial obligations you have. So it can take the form of like a mortgage, or the longer, you know, you go, the more likely you are to have kids, the more likely you are to have parents that are aging that you're caring for. And it just seems like the people who are younger when they do their PhD tend to have a little bit less of an issue with the living on a shoestring budget financial aspect of it. Which is, let me know what you all think of that, but I think it's just worth mentioning because there is a bit of a con in terms of waiting until you go back for it, just because of that, because things tend to come up and it makes the financial and the geography part of it a barrier too. So geographic barriers are a big issue. Particularly for PhDs, because there's some SLPD programs that you can do online where you just every so often fly to the university to do some stuff there, but it's mostly done online. PhD programs really aren't like that. I'm not sure that I know of any of them that you can do as online as you can an SLPD. And so the geographic barriers tend to be more of an issue the more time goes on, where, you know, students who aren't yet married, don't have kids, don't have, you know, families that they're caring for, it tends to be easier to move all around the country to go to the PhD program you want, whereas it can be harder when you're older, I think. Do you guys have anything to comment on regarding to that? And I mean, everybody's path is going to be different, obviously, in terms of when is the best time for them. But I think that's important to mention, because I know so many people who the geographic and financial barriers are just too much when they, you know, hit 35 or 40 and decide they're ready for a PhD. Yeah. Everybody's like, yeah, that's kind of true.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I don't think I'm very lucky being in a position where my husband's worked at this university for like 15 years now. So we're just kind of vested in the area. And so to pick up and move to a brand new place with a child, and our son has autism, so that kind of move is going to be difficult for him anyway. So that factors into whether or not I take a postdoc after, you know, like right now I'm not planning on it, but if the right position were to come up that I could get, then I would consider it. But it would have to be a really good position with somebody I really wanted to learn from, in a program that I thought was really going to be beneficial to my career overall, to uproot my entire family or live away from my family for the duration of a postdoc. So, you know, as I get older, and I'm 36 now, so I'm not, you know, terribly old. Please tell me I'm not terribly old.
You're not old.
Thank you. But it gets harder and harder to think about, you know, uprooting everything that you've built and moving away. And so while I don't regret the path that I've taken, because I think it's worked very well for me, things may have felt easier in terms of postdoc or changing geographic location and pay rate even when I was younger.
Yeah.
So I'll just give, sorry.
Oh.
I was just gonna say one comment and then I'm gonna jump off because I have to go teach. But I know I waited 10 years before going back for my clinical doctorate, and some of that was wanting enough professional experience before deciding to go back, but also feeling like I was prepared enough and having enough knowledge and feeling like, is this what I want to do? And I think there's been some discussion about what path do you want and how do you know what you want to do? And Meredith brought up a good point about SLPD or clinical doctorates. Well, I happen to be actually local to the university I got my degree at. So I was able to actually drive and be local, where there were 5 of us or 6 of us that were actually in my cohort that were local. The rest of us were remote for that cohort, which is the nice flexibility, I think, to an SLPD degree. But that's the choice that I think that you do make when you're making that decision about a PhD versus the clinical doctorate. And I think that you have to make that decision about what you're trying to get the most out of for your degree and what it's bringing to you professionally, personally, and what growth that is going to do for you in either of those realms of your life. But it does make a difference for you. So, but with that being said, thank you for letting me join you all, and I do have to jump off and teach.
Yeah. Thank you, Lindsay. So SLPDs teach, see, because Lindsay's leaving now to go teach, and the rest of us will talk for another 10 or 15 minutes or so to make sure that we cover all the topics. Thank you, Lindsay. Bye. Were you going to say something, Don?
Yeah, I was going to jump in because I think the points you guys brought up about geographic issues is a real one, especially, I think, for a PhD, because there are, you know, clinical doctor programs that are online or mostly online, but a PhD really is a full-time thing, and it's really almost more than a full-time thing. I mean, you benefit from being in the labs you work in and literally just being there and kind of soaking up information. And you pick a PhD program, at least you should be picking a PhD program based on who you want to learn from. And that might be a very select number of people. Maybe it's 3 people in the country that have the expertise that you want to learn from, and they might be located in very far distances from where you currently live. Maybe not. Maybe that's not the case. You could be lucky and that's true, but for a lot of people, it really does involve uprooting and moving to another state, perhaps, for a PhD, so they can work with a certain person to learn from that one certain person. And that's pretty common for a PhD program. Like I said, I think it's a little bit different for a clinical doctorate because some of those programs really do have the ability to do some distance learning aspects to them. But it's PhD programs are different than a clinical doctorate. It's very, very difficult to even think about how you could even do that. A lot of the learning you do from a PhD on an online format.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about the application process really quick, because that's also super different between the SLPD and PhD and super different than a master's degree, right? So for most people who are on this call, especially those of you who have made it all the way through this and listened to us the whole time, you probably are people who know how applying for an SLP master's program works, right? So you get your test scores together and you get your letters of recommendation and your transcripts with your grades and everything, and you put your name at the top and you send it in, and then the universities basically pull the best and brightest of the pack in order to try to fill their graduate student cohort. SLPDs and PhDs don't work that way. So the PhD application process is a much more personal thing where, and you all kind of chime in with what your perspective on it is, but mostly the way I've seen it working is people reach out to a person that they're interested in working with and have conversations with them before they even start to apply to the program. And whether or not you get into that PhD program is really mostly based on the dialogue and kind of like early informal interviews and things like that that have happened between you and that person. And then the paperwork almost in a lot of ways feels like a formality, because a lot of it's just a much more personalized process. So I've seen some people have issues where they think that applying to a PhD program is going to be this situation where you write a letter and put your transcript together and then just blindly send it to a university and see if they accept you. It doesn't really work that way. Do you guys kind of agree? What kind of advice would you give about people applying to PhD programs? I mean, the advice I would give is to email people, to reach out to people that you're interested in working with and set up online chats with them, or if you're lucky enough to live locally, visit them or whatever. But what other advice would you give about the process for applying to a PhD other than just making personal connections and asking people about stuff?
So I agree with you, Meredith, in terms of making that connection early. But I do just want to emphasize that at least at Penn State, you still needed to apply through the official channels of graduate school. So, you still needed to have your GREs within the past 5 years, which a lot of people are a little scared by that. I'm pretty sure you needed 3 or 4 letters of recommendation, and I'm pretty sure 2 of those should have been from PhDs, which again is kind of difficult for some people. Letters of rec, transcripts. So even though you do make those initial connections, with your potential future advisor, there still is all of that legwork. Personal statement is another big one. So I just don't want people to think oh, you just email, get
talk to somebody and then you're in. Yeah,
exactly. So there's still, even if you make that connection and you're really excited, oh, this will be a great student advisor relationship, there's still a ton of work in order to apply to the actual school.
Yeah, to do the paperwork.
Yeah. And that was my experience as well, but it was, there was a lot of paperwork to do, and you had the GRE scores that had to go through, and the application fee, of course, the university has to get, the money for that. But it was kind of a formality. And I was lucky to have somebody I was really interested in doing research with right nearby. But something I've learned in my program and through collaborating with different people just for different projects is that the PhDs out there aren't as scary as I thought they were when I was younger. And so people have been really receptive, even people who have written some of the books that we read in grad school were really receptive to talking about ideas. And so to not be afraid to talk to those people that you think are the, up on the pedestals, because they like talking about their research. They've done a lot of work and they want to share it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Can I ask, while you guys are talking about this, I think it's helpful for people to have in mind, what are you looking for in a mentor or an advisor? Because I think if you're thinking about applying, it's easy to get caught up in how do I make them want me? But kind of what are red flags or what are reasons to say, oh, I really want to go do research with this person or work in this person's lab?
I actually got the same advice that Kelsey did, and that was not to get my PhD unless it was at least partially funded. I know we come back to that, but I do think in those beginning stages of that conversation, it's okay to ask people that you're interested in working with, so your research interest overlap, and you probably are asking more sort of characteristics of a mentor, but I think if you find somebody that you at least just have overlapping interests, it's okay to ask, are you taking PhD students? Do you have the ability to support PhD students, either yourself or your university? Like starting to ask those questions early, I think that would be, I don't see that being something that would put somebody off at that stage, but that's probably not answering your question about the mentor. I just wanted to jump in and add that in.
I think I'll add a little bit about the mentor thing, because especially for a PhD, you really are working with very, very closely with one person, and that is a mentor relationship. That kind of informal interview you guys do, you were talking about before, where you email or you meet someone beforehand before you even apply. I totally agree. I think this is really what you need to do. And meeting people at conferences is another good way to do that also. But that's anytime you meet with someone or interact with them, it's kind of an interview, informal interview from their perspective, but it should be from your perspective too, because you're trying to figure out if you can work with this person for a number of years and if it's going to work out for you as well. So it really should be kind of a joint bi-directional interview. They're interviewing you kind of, but you're also interviewing them. You've got to make sure that you can work with that person too.
I almost would quiz other current doc students at the university because, you know, there's a lot of people who I think would be really fun to sit down and like have coffee with for a couple hours, but that doesn't necessarily tell you a ton about whether or not, what it would be like working with them. You know what I mean? And so, I don't know.
Yeah, I think
other graduate students can help.
I think one of the things that was most helpful for me was actually besides chatting on the phone with both of my mentors, and then visiting the campus and kind of getting a sense for what the lab culture is like, was really to get the contact information of current and former lab members, and just kind of who are at different stages and have different personalities, and you get all these different opinions that, you know, you kind of start to form your own schema of, you know, the truth. And so, yeah, I think that was one of the most helpful things for me.
Yeah. And then the SLPD application process, April, will you kind of like comment on what that's like? Because it's more similar to the master's application process. Would you agree?
After listening to some of everyone's descriptions, it's not too different from the PhD, actually. In my experience, I reached out to a person who I thought would be a wonderful mentor. I met with her. I met with the coordinator for the program before I even applied. But then it was that formal application process without the GRE, which was huge for me because I would have had to take the GRE because I don't have a current GRE score. So that was
cool. Just to interrupt you real quick, that's a rule that varies from university to university. Whether or not they need a GRE, whether it's PhD or SLPD, is a university rule usually. So.
Mm-hmm. And there were other programs, types of programs that I considered, specifically the educational doctorate was also an option that we haven't really talked much about, but I do see a lot of SLPs looking at that option too, especially who are looking into teaching and clinical instruction. And most of those programs that I found required GE. I just lost the acronym. You know what I mean? Yeah, the GRE score. After I formally applied, I sent my trade scripts, I sent my resume, my vita, and then I had to write several different essays and obtain letters of recommendation. Then I had a formal interview. So not too different, but yeah, it probably falls in the middle of PhD and master's.
Yeah. And we should, since you brought up the topic of EdD, we should probably discuss that very briefly. I'm not an expert on the EdD. I should have brought an EdD friend on the call, because I do know people who work in academia in SLP departments who have an EdD, not a PhD. But in like kind of like the trajectory of things, it can be viewed as a step below a PhD in terms of like research rigor, kind of depending on where you got your EdD from, but it would be considered more terminal, so more at the tail end of training than an SLPD. Tends to have a bit more of
I would agree. Yeah.
More of an ed focus. But any other comments that you guys want to chime in to like differentiate it? But that is an option too. So if you guys are weighing these things and are looking for something kind of in between, an EdD could be another option.
Yeah, it may change for university to university, but I know here a lot of the EdD programs are more not prescribed. The students get to choose what departments where they want to take classes, but the classes are existing courses. Mm-hmm. Whereas within our SLP department, we're doing a lot of independent studies, and where we're like, I'm the only student in a lot of my classes. So I do a lot of work, and the focus is directly on me or the other students in my cohort, the classes they're taking. So sometimes you long for that course that's been kind of prescribed from what, August to December, and then it's all over.
Yeah.
I think another thing to consider is that you can also get a PhD in like linguistics and psychology in a different area. And so it's kind of, for me, who's like, I'm a very indecisive person, it was just like whoosh, a lot of different decisions, right?
Yeah. Neuroscience, all sorts of stuff that you could, yeah. I'm looking at my little list of questions that people have asked us, and I want to kind of look at some of these like hot topic things. Topic. A lot of people, when I asked them online what things they wanted us to chat about, a really common question was, I haven't decided what topic I want to get my PhD on yet, and so I'm afraid to apply. Comments on that? I know what I would say. You don't need to choose a topic at the get-go. You just need to have an idea of whether or not you want to do the PhD. I mean, there's going to be certain like labs and mentors that you'd be more interested in working with because of certain topics that you're passionate about. Like, for example, I wouldn't have been happy in certain labs that focused on like things I wasn't as interested in. But at the same time, you don't need to know what your dissertation is going to need to be. And you can walk into a PhD program having like 4 different interests or 8 different interests, and it is a non-issue. Would you guys kind of agree with that? And
it'll probably change.
Yeah, and it changes over time. So don't try to think that you have to like know what you want your topic to be, because you have a lot of time to learn it.
You have a couple years of stats classes before you have to decide.
Yeah. Yeah.
I almost think it's kind of like choosing a major in undergrad, right? Like, there are some people that go in and they're sure that they're pre-med, and then 2 years in they actually change course. I had colleagues that were very sure that they knew what they were going to do their dissertation on, and then completely did something different. So I think there's definitely parameters, right? So like if you're in a language learning lab, like you're not going to be doing dysphagia, but there's still a lot of room to grow and kind of take classes that are in different departments, to do projects that are in the same department with a different professor in a different lab. So I think one of the things as a master's student that I had to learn, like transitioning to a PhD student, was like to actually reach out to people, to actually make those connections on my own, and that people aren't gonna, close their doors or shut you away. They're actually excited to work with you or excited to hear what ideas you have.
Yeah.
Let me expand on something a little bit. We've been kind of talking a little bit about already, is this idea that in PhD programs especially, but also in clinical doctorate programs, you largely make your own academic program. You largely choose your own courses. And you work with a committee, your mentor and a committee that helps advise you, but you get to pick what courses you want to take, which is why a doctorate is so different than a master's program or a bachelor's degree, and also why the doctorate is really so cool. And it gives you things you can't get other ways. As we're kind of going through this, and a lot of the answers you're giving, to me, if I hadn't gone through any programs, I'd be like, wow, this is scary stuff. It actually sounds pretty difficult to even think about going into the doctorate program, clinical doctorate or PhD, but it's different. It's a different graduate program. The fact that you could pick your own courses, there's always some courses that everyone has to take, like statistics and things, a sequence, but you pick the courses you're interested in, and that can change. Yeah, you might come in with a general topic and then make it more specific, or maybe that general topic even changes a fair amount as you go through some of these courses. But that's what makes the doctorate programs special. The fact that you can study what you want to study. There's nothing else like that. There's no other programs like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I loved being a PhD student. Like, I absolutely loved being a PhD student. And I tell people this all the time. Like, when I look back at my life and like certain chunks of time where I had a lot of like joy and freedom and flexibility to just kind of learn and explore, like my PhD was the best. I would redo it over and over and over again if I could, because you get to basically design, you know, what you're going to learn about, and you know, the person that you're going to kind of shape yourself into being. And it's really fun. I personally found it to be more fun than scary, which it makes sense why people would, you know, think that it's intimidating or scary. And there is, of course, you know, some stress as involved in any, you know, big thing that you take on, but I thought that it was mostly fun.
I think I'm having a blast with it. And I think at first it was really, I was anxious about the whole process. And then I realized, one, nothing is permanent. So you can change your interests, and that's normal. And two, the idea is that you're learning content, but the idea is learning the process of research and how to learn the things you want to know and answer the questions you want to answer. And as soon as I kind of accepted those two ideas, that nothing is permanent and it's process over content, it got really fun.
Yeah.
So I'm with you. I'm having a great time. In fact, I'm drawing it out. It's been a lot of years. I'm not done yet.
Just do it as long as you can. It's a wonderful.
I want to keep going until they kick me out, right?
Okay, so I'm looking at
Meredith.
Oh, go ahead.
Just one more thing I think about the topic. When I hear people say like, oh, I haven't picked my topic, I think they're already thinking about the dissertation, like the research topic. And I think it's important to note that like no one expects you to come in day one with a study planned or like get to work. You're starting your own research today. It's day one. Like you're involved in other people's research. You're supporting research. You're gathering your ideas. It's just constantly evolving. I just want to make that point that I think I did have a little bit of that. Like I'm expected to start today. Like I have to design it and do it now. And that is just so not how it is. Maybe that's just me, but I was very afraid like, oh, I have to come in and start doing, where you're learning and doing, like you were saying, Molly, kind of simultaneously. And I just like had to get sort of comfortable with being uncomfortable. Things were evolving as they evolved. So
I had the same experience in that when I came in, I had the option of doing a completely independent study, you know, do what you want. What are you interested in? But then I also had the option to hop on projects that were already going on in the lab. And I actually ended up kind of doing both, which was great in that, you know, I had my own independent line that I was building, but I was still gaining so much valuable experience, like, you know, being in the lab and working with other researchers.
Oh, I was just going to say, for me in my first year, I was like the youngest in my lab. And so I would look around and everybody's like busily like, you know, like doing their data, doing their analyses in R and like doing all this, I mean, what seemed like, you know, crazy, impossible to achieve things. And I was just like, am I supposed to be doing like all of this and more? It just felt like nothing was enough. And then I had to like finally ask somebody, and they were like, no, like you just got here, like it's okay, you know? Yeah, so I think sometimes just like getting perspective from somebody and like telling them how you feel, and having them tell you like, I remember feeling this way, and like it took me 2 years to learn how to use this software and I still don't know how to use it, is really helpful.
That would be super intimidating, walking into a lab and seeing all these older doc students or more advanced doc students running stats on the computer, and you're like, what am I supposed to be doing? That would be intimidating. Okay, so Another issue that I want to bring up that actually came up pretty frequently when I was asking people to send us questions for tonight is, and I'm going to quote this one directly, and we're going to go to SLPD here instead of PhD for a minute. Somebody asked me, what measurable way is an SLPD beneficial? And then somebody else asked me about what the practical benefits of getting an SLPD would be. And so I kind of see like this common thread in people's questions about an SLPD. And I think a lot of it stems from the fact that, like we've said multiple times, it's a newer degree and not that many people have it. People have a lot of questions about what they like get for it or what they are going to get from it, where and that's something that I think is really different than getting a master's degree, right? Because when we get our master's degree, it's like you get the degree, then you get a job, and it's kind of lockstep in that way. And the fact that in our field, it's, I'm not going to say easy, I hate saying the word easy, but it's reasonable enough to get employed as an SLP that it kind of is like that, where it's like step 1, get degree, step 2, get job, the end, right? An SLPD isn't like that. You're not going to be able to necessarily have like firm data that says that if you get this SLPD, then you will have X or Y after it. There's going to be work that comes after it in terms of continuing to pursue the opportunities for advancement that you want. And the SLPD will give you training for that, and the SLPD will help prepare you for that, and the SLPD will even, you know, give you something on paper that gives you a little bit more credibility, right, in terms of like being able to take some of those advanced clinical roles. But you still are going to be making a lot of decisions for yourself and putting the effort in to kind of like go up that ladder. April, do you have any thoughts on that? I don't know. I just, when people ask me these questions, they're like, no, but I want to know what I'm going to get for getting an SLPD. I'm like, well,
you can get a lot if you're looking for the right things. I think my main motivation for getting my SLPD was return on investment. Given my age and how long I plan on working, is it worth it for me to get an SLPD as opposed to a different degree? So that was one of the factors. And also my husband's a banker, but that's a different story. So that's one part of it. I see a lot of benefit to the SLPD in my role. Teaching is my why for being in higher education, and an SLPD degree allows me to engage in the kind of teaching that I want to do. Some accreditation, and for those of you who maybe have more experience in higher ed, chime in. Some accreditors for higher education, universities, institutions, and whatnot, won't allow you to teach certain courses without a certain degree. Mm-hmm. And so getting that advanced degree for me was a way that I could teach the classes that I wanted to teach. So that's how I measure it personally. But then the other would be just return on investment.
Yeah. And people outside of academia, so let's say you're getting an SLPD, but you have no interest whatsoever in teaching. People do it, to be perfectly frank, sometimes for, you know, marketing reasons, where they basically need a way to quickly prove that they're an expert in some, you know, section of our field. And so they use the degree as a way to kind of like have quick and fast proof of that, you know, to be perfectly honest.
And I think that the clinical doctorate really does open doors for maybe healthcare administrative roles, even educational administrative roles, depending on where you're at. I think that there are those opportunities for SLPD graduates.
And even kind of little things, like I can imagine if, say you're someone who you want to be someone who gives CEU courses to other SLPs, and you want to get hired by one of the like large companies that does online CEUs for SLPs, for example. I won't name names, but I can see you getting an opportunity to teach online and give CEU courses quicker with an SLPD than with a master's degree, perhaps, you know, and whether or not you think that's fair or appropriate or whatever, like it, you know, some of those advantages are going to come from that. Any other things that you feel like people are going to want to know about the differences? Danielle, have you seen any other questions that you think that we haven't address tonight?
I want to add in response to the last question, that talking to some people who already have their SLPD, and then talking to other people in similar fields, so like health professions type fields who have a clinical doctorate, that's not entry level, so not thinking about PT at this point. They all use that phrase, open doors. So I don't know how that's measurable, but they're consistently saying it. And I think that they do tend to speak to this idea that they feel more confident in synthesizing the information that they're consuming, so that they viewed themselves as strong clinicians before, and now so much better at taking the information and truly understanding it and using it. And so, I mean, that's not measurable in dollars necessarily, but if you're in it to become a better clinician, in talking to people, it seems to give people that feeling, at least. And like, I think it was Javier that mentioned that in a PhD program, you have to go and approach people. Maybe that was someone else, but like, you have to go initiate things. And it seems like the framework of doctoral education makes you better at that generally, regardless of what degree it is. And I wonder if that's a piece of the why it opens doors. No, I mean, I feel like we've covered lots of good questions tonight. I think the trick is how it will evolve, right? Because like you keep saying, it's new. And I think we need more PhDs / people with doctorates in our field. And so it'll be interesting to see if either SLPDs become more popular or PhDs find ways to accommodate more students who have limitations that are keeping them from signing up now
for PhD programs. Yeah. I think it'll be really interesting to see, 10 years from now, kind of what the SLPD thing looks like and how people are feeling about it and that type of stuff. I see a lot of one other thing that someone messaged me just earlier today was they said, I hope that when you pull together this content for us, that it's not biased. And I was like, biased? What do you mean by bias? So I asked her, I was like, what type of bias do you expect to see? And she said, bias against SLPDs, that our degree isn't as valuable as a PhD. Now, that's an awkward thing to say. But those of you who know me well enough know that if I see something awkward and if I see something bothering people, I'm going to just bring it up anyway, because I think that that is something that we are going to have to work through in our field, so that people with SLPDs, because it is new and it is different and it is, something that we haven't seen before, we are going to have to start, figuring out how to elevate the people that are in those roles. Because to be perfectly honest, people who are doing the SLPD are incredibly important people in terms of leadership in our field. Because the PhD is a research degree and because the SLPD is for advanced clinical roles, these people are going to be really well suited to be leaders in our field and making our field stronger. And so I do think that collectively it's important that we support people who want to do that type of thing and help them figure out good paths to, bring up our field. So
I think one thing to remember is that a doctorate is not a doctorate. A PhD is a different degree than a clinical doctorate, which is a different degree than the EDD. Mm-hmm. You're trained literally differently, and your experiences you get are different. Each of them does open doors that we're talking about. And sometimes they can open the same door, but sometimes those doors are different based on that training. So a PhD is not the same as a clinical doctorate in terms of what you get out of it, right? They're not the same. That doesn't mean that one is more valuable than the other. It's just that they are different.
Yeah, there's different training for different paths, and yeah.
Well, like my little schema of what all of these degrees are, it kind of, you have that like research to practice gap. You have the bridge or the valley, you know, and clinicians are trying to get to researchers, researchers trying to get to clinicians. And I kind of always viewed the clinical doctorate as kind of a really great key player in helping bridge that gap because of their training, extensive training clinically, but also maybe a better grasp on digesting that research. So
Yes.
I think that it's going to be really interesting to see what happens over the next 10 years, just like you said, because I think that maybe this could help us kind of accomplish this big mission that we're all trying to accomplish.
100%. Any last thoughts, things you want to make sure that people hear, or questions you think people would have that we haven't addressed?
I might also mention that the clinical doctorate is standard for physical therapy, and it's now becoming, in the next few years, going to be more widely seen across occupational therapy programs. And so a lot of times clinicians will ask the question, what does that mean for SLP? Does the clinical doctorate, is that where our profession is going? I don't have a good answer for that, but I think it's something that's on the clinician's mind.
Yeah. Yeah, none of us have the answer to that because none of us have the the power to forecast what's actually going to happen. But I'm willing to say this, that based on conversations I've been in with other people, if I was a betting person and was betting whether or not a doctorate is going to be, considered a requirement in order to practice as an SLP, I would put all my money on no. I don't think that's going to happen in our field personally, but I guess never say never, right? But yeah.
You can bring up the AUD issue, right? Because now the entry-level degree for audiology is an AUD. That's a clinical doctorate.
Mm-hmm.
But I agree. I don't think the master's is going away. Everyone I've talked to who's involved in the clinical doctorate program, they don't talk about it as in, we're going to take over and this is going to be, the terminal degree for this will be the entry-level degree for speech language pathologists. I'm not hearing people talk like that, like they were with the AUD. So I don't see it changing that dramatically.
Yeah.
I think it's going to remain an option, and a very good option, depending on what the person wants in terms of their training, their expertise.
Yep.
One other thing I'd like to add, it was interesting, Meredith, as you said that word bias. I was kind of thinking about that actually related to the PhD, and just thinking about people who are pursuing either degree with the intention of going into higher education for teaching. A lot of us, if you're getting a PhD, you're getting a PhD more often than not from a very research-intensive university. They have the doctoral programs, many of them. And so for me, it was really important in my course to understand that not every university operated like that. And so when Don was talking about research, teaching, and service, understanding that those jobs for professors in higher education can look totally different based on the university. That took me like my first year of the PhD program to figure that out and realize that I was getting some bias from my mentors about, oh yeah, you have to do all this research and research and research. Well, I ended up and chose to be at a teaching intensive university. I have research requirements, but I was realizing I was getting sort of this bias of this is the path because that's all the path. That's what my mentors had done. And so trying to understand if higher education is your goal, talking to people from different types of universities and different roles at those different types of universities, I think that's a step we often miss. We kind of can get pigeonholed into all of the universities are like this, but understanding the priorities of research and teaching, and then how tenure-track faculty differs from instructor, differs from adjunct. Those are questions I think really worth pursuing for those interested in going into higher education.
Yeah. The more people you can talk to from different university backgrounds, the more clear your picture that's going to be.
Mm-hmm.
Any other last minute thoughts, things you want to make sure people know?
I had a quick, similar thought to yours. So, one second, I forgot. Okay. Yeah, so reaching out and talking to people, I found that going to different conferences, so going to linguistics conferences, child language conferences, ASHA, state conferences, and just getting a feel for you know, what are people that are in a similar situation in a different lab, in a different university, like what are they going through? What are their options? What mechanisms have they gone through? What job prospects are they looking at? Because I think Danielle was talking about, like, you know, if I know that this is where I want to go, how do I get there? And I almost feel like that's kind of a hard question, because going through the PhD program, it almost feels like what you want is a moving target. And so, and to your point of, like, you know, your mentors are telling you, like, our one tenure track position is the only job available, either implicitly or directly. I think talking to people, so a brief example is, through my training in statistics and data science, I've met a lot of people in the data science community, and have a very different, like, configuration of skills and like experiences, and some of them have PhDs and, you know, started in academia and then moved to an industry position, and vice versa, you know, and I think seeing all of these different, like, possibilities is really exciting, and it's like that opening door idea. I think, yeah, it just a lot more ideas of like more questions to ask and more things to pursue. I think that's part of what the PhD is. So
yeah, PhDs who go into industry isn't even something that we've considered, but that's a whole other, like, ball game in terms of how you can use your degree to end up working for a company. But ask people about that.
Last word I'll say.
Yeah.
We've talked for an hour and a half about some of the challenges in pursuing a doctorate, clinical doctorate, or PhD, and it can sound pretty overwhelming, I think, for hearing us talk for an hour and a half about some of these realities. Don't get discouraged. You can do it. I mean, it's absolutely doable. It's different than an undergrad degree. It's different than a master's degree. And in a lot of ways, it is so much cooler, so much more fun, and you can do it.
For sure. I think it's a common misconception that people feel like people who get PhDs are, like, way smarter than the average human being, or, like, way more motivated than the average human being. And even though, like, as, you know, SLPDs and PhDs and scientists, it's like, well, maybe I am pretty smart, you know, it's like, not, it's a bias that we don't necessarily mind being attached to our names, but at the same time, it's problematic, and that sometimes if people feel like that's who we are, it distances them from us and makes them feel like they're people unlike us, when in reality, like, the only thing that all of us have in common is that we are curious people who want to learn, and that's about it. Beyond being just someone who wants to learn more, there's really no other requirement.
I guarantee everyone who's either in or has been in a PhD program has suffered from imposter syndrome at one point or another.
Yeah, exactly.
Exactly. Absolutely. The more we learn how much we don't know, but then at the same time, the world gets that much more fascinating. So I think that that Don makes a great point. You can do it, and it's going to be, it'll be hard work, but it's fun.
Yeah.
And I think we'd all echo that, what Meredith was saying before. It's a really rewarding and exciting and different experience from a master's degree, where you can get to really choose your own path. We've all had really unique and individualized experiences where we've gotten to make our own kind of our own schedules and our own course loads ourselves, and choose our own courses catered to exactly what we like and what we feel we need to make our unique experiences in our programs. So
there's not many places you can do that. You can't really do that in jobs, right?
Right.
Choose what you want to do.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you all for your time. I'll let you get back to your evenings. And those of you who've actually watched this entire thing with us, you have to do it. If you've been here for an hour and a half listening to us talk about this, that means you're officially doing this now. So ask other people about it too, so you can get more perspectives, and hopefully this has been helpful. Night, everyone.